I never thought this would be my story. I'm not some person who imagined betrayal in a relationship like mine. But then again, life doesn't care about what we imagine, does it? My name is Zacharias Morgan, but everyone calls me Zach. I'm a technical specialist at a big IT company, one of those roles that seems to consume your entire existence. It's funny. I remember thinking that I had it all figured out when I first met Esme. We were young, ambitious, and so in love. At least, I thought I was. We had 2 kids, a nice house, and what seemed to be an ideal life. I thought that, just like in some fairy tale, love would always carry us through. But love is different when you're married for over a decade. When work takes priority, when distractions pull you in every direction. She was everything to me once, beautiful, smart, and full of life. But as time passed, the spark in her eyes started fading. Not because of me, at least that's what I thought at first. I was just busy with work. More and more, I found myself at the office, grinding away on tech projects that demanded all my attention. It wasn't that I didn't love her or the kids. I did. But work became my refuge. When Esme needed me to be present, to help with the kids, to spend time with her, I was always too caught up with deadlines or the never-ending flow of emails. My answer to everything was simple: everything's fine, just a lot of work. But things weren't fine. And deep down, I knew it. I just kept pushing the thought away because the reality was too painful to face. Esme. She wasn't the kind of woman to just sit around and wait for me forever. She came from a family where emotions and closeness mattered. Every time I came home, I'd find her sitting there, looking at me with a mix of frustration and longing. I could see the ache in her eyes, but I told myself it would pass. It always passed. I thought I could fix it later, once the project was done or the team was finished with this deadline. But she didn't wait forever. Esme worked as a psychologist, but her career never really took off the way she'd hoped. She had ambitions, but somehow it felt like she was stuck in a routine, overwhelmed by the same issues, doing the same thing every day. I never noticed the slow, steady shift in her until it was too late. Slowly, she began to feel unimportant, invisible in a house filled with noise and deadlines. And it wasn't long before she found someone who made her feel seen. That someone was Jared Rivers, or Jerry as he liked to be called. He worked in a different department at the company, handling marketing and strategy. Jerry was everything I wasn't. He was social, outgoing, and had this carefree, magnetic energy that seemed to draw people in. His charisma was something I'd never had, and it was something Esme seemed to crave. I remember the first time she mentioned him, just casually, nothing alarming. I was talking to Jerry about work today. He's such a good listener. At first, I didn't think much of it. I didn't have time to. But as time passed, I noticed they were spending more time together. Corporate events, after-work drinks, casual chats at lunch, all things I never made time for anymore. And then came the night of the company party. It was a celebration of the success of one of my projects. It should have been a night for us to celebrate as a team, but I was preoccupied with work even during the event. There was a part of me that tried to enjoy it, but I couldn't fully pull myself away. I was pulled into conversations about future projects, budgets, all the stuff that took me away from my family. And Esme? She wasn't exactly the life of the party. She hung back, sipping her drink, looking like she didn't belong. I didn't even realize she'd been talking to Jerry for the last hour. I should have noticed. I should have cared. Later, when I finally caught up with her, I saw that look in her eyes, like she had something to say but didn't know how to say it. Jerry had filled the space that used to belong to me. We never really talked about what happened that night. But looking back, I know that was the moment. That was when the distance grew too wide. It wasn't long after that night when I began noticing changes, subtle at first, but unmistakable once they began. Esme had always been emotionally open, maybe too much so, but now, she seemed distant, almost secretive. She was more aloof when I tried to engage with her. Her eyes lacked the warmth they once held for me. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just a phase, some emotional phase she was going through. Maybe the move had been too stressful, maybe work was getting to her too. So, I kept my distance. I'd come home, sit at my desk, and bury myself in my work. I never noticed the void growing between us. But Esme wasn't just sitting there, waiting for me to notice. She was looking for something. Something she wasn't getting from me. And then the calls started. At first, it was nothing, work-related, friendly chats. But then, Jared began to call more often. He'd call to check in on her, ask how she was doing, even talk about things outside of work. At first, I didn't think much of it. But it wasn't long before I noticed the way she'd smile after one of his calls. It was the kind of smile she used to have when we were first together. The kind that made me feel special. It was the kind of smile that shouldn't have been for anyone but me. I didn't say anything. Not at first. I convinced myself that everything was fine. That she was just finding comfort in a friend. But then came that moment, the one I'll never forget. Olivia, our 9-year-old daughter, asked her mom one night, "Mom, why does Dad never have time for us anymore?" It was like a knife to my chest. I could see the hurt in Esme's eyes, the guilt. But there was something more in her gaze, a realization. She wasn't just invisible to me. She was invisible to her kids too. And in that moment, Esme's gaze shifted. She didn't just want to be seen by me. She needed to be seen by someone. And Jared had become that someone. And that was when I began to realize, it wasn't just the work. It wasn't just the late nights or the deadlines. It was me. I had become invisible to the woman I loved, and I was too blind to see it. But what I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning, and the path we were on would lead to far darker places. It's strange how something so wrong can feel so right in the moment. That's how I felt when Esme walked through the door that night, looking different. There was a confidence in her step, a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in ages. I didn't even recognize her, and that was my fault. I had stayed late at the office, as usual, convincing myself that I was doing the right thing, putting in the extra hours, finishing the project that would help our team. But when I came home that night, I found myself standing at the door, staring at Esme's face. She was there, but she wasn't really there. Her eyes were distant, like she was carrying some heavy secret she didn't want to share with me. We didn't talk much. She was exhausted, or at least that's what she said. I didn't push it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. Something bigger than the distance that had been growing between us over the past months. Later, I found out that she had agreed to meet Jared after work. It wasn't planned. It wasn't supposed to happen. But the way things unfolded that night, I don't think either of them could have predicted it. She went to Jared's place for dinner. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the first step over the line. When I think about it now, I realized that she was already stepping out of her marriage. She wasn't just meeting a friend. She wasn't just talking about work. She was there for something more. I couldn't have known then, but Esme was feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seen, desired, appreciated. All the things I had failed to give her, Jared was offering freely. They spent hours talking, laughing, things I couldn't remember doing with her. It wasn't about work, or kids, or deadlines. It was about her needs, her feelings. And as the evening wore on, I know it wasn't just conversation that filled the silence between them. There were kisses, soft, gentle, the kind that ignites something inside you. Esme wasn't just my wife anymore. She was a woman who was being treated like she mattered. I can't say I was surprised when she came home late that night. I knew something was off, but I didn't want to confront it. Not yet. I had already gotten used to her pulling away from me. So when she walked through the door, looking different, like a person who just had an emotional awakening, I told myself it was nothing. She was tired, that's all. Just a phase. But it wasn't a phase. I asked her why she seemed so tired. I asked her why she was distant. I had to know what was going on. But when I pushed, she shut down. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to answer. It was like I was talking to a stranger. Esme, what's going on? I asked her again, and this time, my voice cracked. Why do you look like that? Her answer came in the form of silence, and then she turned away, heading to the bedroom. Please don't go to bed without talking to me, I said, but she just closed the door. I stood there, seething. I couldn't figure out what was happening. All I knew was that something was wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it. The next few days were a blur. I could feel her slipping away from me more each day. Jared's name kept coming up in conversation. At first, I thought it was innocent, just casual mentions here and there. But as time went on, I realized that she was talking about him more often, about his advice, his energy, his support. And then, the phone calls. Her phone would ring constantly, and she always stepped away to take them. The sound of her voice changed when she talked to him, light and playful in a way I hadn't heard in years. It was the kind of voice I used to hear when we were first together, the kind that made me feel special. But it wasn't for me anymore. One evening, I found myself standing in the hallway when she was on one of those calls. I could hear her laughter. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was a full, unrestrained laugh. The kind of laugh that I hadn't heard from her in so long. The kind of laugh that wasn't for me. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't sit by and pretend I didn't know. I needed to know the truth. So, I did something I'd never done before. I followed her. I had told myself that I was going to work late, but instead, I waited until she left the house. I told myself it was to give her some space, to let her have time for herself. But really, I knew. I watched as she walked out the door, got into her car, and drove off. I followed her all the way to Jared's place. I saw her park and get out. And just like that, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. She was with him. She was with Jared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to confront her right then and there, or wait until she came home. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw things, to demand answers. But I just stood there, staring at her car, watching as she walked into his house. When I finally went home, I was numb. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't even process the anger building inside me. The worst part? I wasn't even surprised. I should have been, but I wasn't. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. I stood at the door when Esme came home, looking exhausted as always. But this time, I wasn't going to pretend. What's going on between you and Jared? I asked, my voice sharp. What the hell is happening? She froze. She knew she couldn't lie anymore. Her eyes darted away, and then she looked at me. Zach, I'm sorry. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Don't apologize. Just tell me the truth. She let out a long breath. I don't know how it happened. It just did. Jared. He made me feel important. He gave me the attention I needed. You stopped seeing me. You stopped noticing me. And I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Her words cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I couldn't. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, unable to understand how everything I'd worked for could crumble in a single moment. I don't know if I can forgive you, Esme, I said, my voice hoarse. But I don't know if I can keep living like this either. She looked at me, eyes full of regret. I don't know either. I decided to take time away. I needed to clear my head. A week, maybe more. I told her I was going to the countryside. I needed space to think about what I wanted to do. But what she asked me, what she said next, shook me to my core. Do you want to try to save this? Do you want to save our marriage? I didn't have an answer for her. I couldn't give her one. The week I spent alone in the countryside did more than just give me space. It gave me clarity, but not the kind I was hoping for. I spent every night staring at the stars, thinking about Esme, about what she had done, about how everything had unraveled. There was a part of me that still wanted to fix things, to believe that maybe, just maybe, our marriage could survive this. But after the confession, after seeing her face as she admitted to what she'd done, I realized something. I couldn't forgive her. I couldn't just let this go. What she had done was not just a betrayal. It was an attack on everything I had worked for. My family, my trust, my self-worth. And then there was Jared. He wasn't just some guy she had met at work. He was the one who took her from me. The one who saw the cracks in our marriage and decided to exploit them. I hated him for it. I hated him for making my wife feel special when I hadn't been able to do the same. I hated him for taking what wasn't his to take. But I wasn't just angry. I was calculating. And I knew that if I was going to get revenge, it couldn't just be about hurting them emotionally. It had to be deeper than that. I had to strike at their most vulnerable points. And that's when I noticed Tanya. Tanya Rivers, Jared's wife. I had never paid much attention to her before. She worked in HR at our company, and we didn't interact much. But I started to see the signs. Tanya had been distant from Jared for a while. I began hearing things around the office. Whispers. Colleagues talking about how she had been complaining about Jared's sudden obsession with work, how he was no longer the same husband he had been before. She'd voiced her frustrations to her friends, saying that Jared was becoming increasingly secretive, almost cold. It was like their relationship had faded into the background while Jared had focused on his own needs. I saw an opportunity. Over the next few days, I made a point to start talking to Tanya. Casual chats at work, nothing too obvious, nothing too personal at first. But I was patient. I listened to her when she talked about Jared, about how he had changed. I didn't offer advice at first, but I sympathized with her. I let her talk about her frustrations, about how neglected she felt. And with every conversation, she opened up more. She didn't know it yet, but she was already falling into my trap. I didn't want her to know that I had an agenda, but I wanted her to believe that I understood her better than Jared ever had. Tanya needed someone to listen to her, someone who would make her feel important, someone who could give her the attention she wasn't getting at home. And I was more than willing to provide that. The more we talked, the closer we grew. Tanya began leaning on me more. She started confiding in me about her marriage, about how she had been thinking of leaving Jared. She told me she wasn't sure what to do, but the idea of being free from him seemed tempting. I never rushed her. I didn't have to. I just quietly encouraged her to think about her options, to explore what else was out there, to realize that she deserved more than what Jared had given her. And every word I spoke, every bit of advice I offered, pushed her further away from Jared. Little by little, she began seeing me not just as a colleague, but as someone who genuinely understood her, someone who could offer her a way out. But this wasn't just about her. This was part of my plan to take everything from Jared. As weeks went by, I began to notice a change in Esme. She wasn't the same woman who had confessed to me about her affair. She was uneasy, constantly on edge, like she could feel the shift in the air. She could sense that something was wrong, but she didn't know what. And it wasn't just my distance. Although I made sure to keep her at arm's length, it was also Tanya. Esme started noticing the way Tanya and I interacted at work. We were always talking now, always sharing private jokes and personal details. She overheard a conversation between us at a company retreat, where we were talking about a private matter. It wasn't anything substantial, but Esme heard the tone in my voice, the way I looked at Tanya, and I saw the suspicion growing in her eyes. She began to question everything. The guilt didn't hit her immediately, but it was coming. I could see it in her eyes when she caught me looking at Tanya across the room. The regret, the doubt, the realization that maybe she had ruined everything. But she didn't know how to fix it, and she wasn't the one in control anymore. Tanya, on the other hand, kept confiding in me. She told me how Jared had become increasingly distant, how he had stopped showing her affection, how his obsession with work had taken over their marriage. She was confused, lost, and unsure of what to do next. But I made sure to always reassure her. You deserve better than him, Tanya. I'd tell her, and she'd nod in agreement, her eyes filled with both sorrow and relief. I never pushed her for anything. Not yet. But with every conversation, I could see that Tanya was slowly beginning to consider a future without Jared. And that was exactly what I wanted. But the thing about revenge is that it's never as smooth as it seems in your head. Jared was no fool. He could see that something was wrong. He noticed the way Tanya and I were growing closer, the way we exchanged glances, the way we spoke privately. One afternoon, I was walking to my car after work when I saw him standing by his vehicle, waiting for Tanya to come out. He looked angry, his face tight with frustration. As soon as Tanya walked out the door, he grabbed her arm and pulled her aside. Is there something going on between you and Zach? Jared demanded, his voice low and angry. Tanya looked taken aback, clearly startled by his accusation. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice shaking. Don't lie to me, Jared snapped. I've seen you too. I've seen the way you look at him. What the hell is going on? Tanya was flustered, clearly caught off guard. She couldn't lie to him, but she also couldn't admit the truth. She hesitated for a moment, and I saw her eyes flicker nervously. I don't know what you mean, she stammered. Jared wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed as he pushed her again. You're hiding something. What's going on between you two? I need to know. I could see the fear in Tanya's face. She was scared of what would happen if she told him the truth, and I could see Jared's jealousy burning through him, a wildfire threatening to destroy everything. I knew I had to move carefully from here on out. Jared was getting suspicious, and things were beginning to unravel faster than I'd expected. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Revenge, I knew, required patience, and I was willing to wait. But as the web of deceit grew tighter, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was setting myself up for something I couldn't control. It's strange how quickly everything can fall apart. One minute, you're just playing your cards, taking calculated steps, and the next, the house of cards comes crashing down. I didn't expect things to go the way they did that night at the company's annual gala. But then again, when you're dealing with anger, jealousy, and alcohol, anything can happen. It started off innocent enough. Just the usual corporate event, the usual forced pleasantries. People in suits, loud music, clinking glasses. But there was tension in the air, an unspoken thing, hovering between me and Jared. It had been building for weeks, and that night, it finally boiled over. Jared had been watching me all evening, shooting me glances, his face growing more and more frustrated. I could tell he was on edge, and I knew exactly why. Tanya and I had been getting closer, and he could sense it, but he didn't know what to do with it. And that was his mistake. After too many drinks, he found me in the corner of the ballroom, away from the crowd. His face was flushed, his words slurring as he stumbled over to me. "Are you trying to steal my wife, Morgan?" he spat, his voice low but full of venom. I looked at him, unfazed. "You've been ignoring her for months, Jared. Don't act like you care now." My voice was calm, but I felt the heat of his anger building. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. "Don't you dare talk about her like that," he growled, stepping closer to me. His fists were clenched, and I could feel the tension in his body as he tried to hold himself back. I met his gaze with a steady one of my own. "You've been too busy with your work and your own ego to even notice she was unhappy. Don't act like I'm the bad guy here." The words hung in the air for a moment before the shouting started. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. Jared's face contorted in fury, and in that instant, all the alcohol in his system took over. He lunged at me, shoving me hard against the wall. I don't know if it was the alcohol or just pure adrenaline, but I didn't flinch. I shoved him back, and we both stumbled, getting tangled in a mess of limbs and angry words. The fight was loud. Too loud. People started turning their heads, whispering behind their hands, watching the drama unfold. The gala turned into a spectacle, with onlookers forming a circle around us, some laughing nervously, others with wide eyes. I was too angry to care. That was when Sasha Knight, our mutual friend and someone who had always been close to me, stepped in. She'd been watching the fight from the edge of the crowd, and before either of us could take another swing, she rushed over to us. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice firm. "What the hell are you two doing? This isn't the place for this." But instead of calming us down, her intervention only made things worse. Jared and I both turned on her, our tempers flaring. She was stuck in the middle, trying to pull us apart, but the more she tried to stop us, the more we pushed back. Finally, Sasha stormed off, leaving both of us standing there, breathing heavily, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Everyone at the gala was talking about us. The whispers were louder than the music, and I knew that things would never be the same. Later that night, Tanya found out about the fight. A coworker had seen everything and told her, and she wasted no time confronting me. When she called, her voice was sharp with anger. "You let it get out of control, Zach. You embarrassed me. What the hell were you thinking?" she demanded. I wasn't in the mood for apologies. I wasn't sorry for what had happened. Jared deserved it, I said, my voice cold. He pushed me. I didn't start it. "You still shouldn't have done that," Tanya snapped. "This is getting too messy. I don't know if I can handle all of this." I could hear the conflict in her voice, the uncertainty. It made my stomach turn, but I didn't let it show. "You don't have to handle anything, Tanya," I said, trying to reassure her. "You deserve better than him. Don't forget that." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she finally admitted, "but I don't know if I'm ready to leave him yet." I could feel her hesitation, but I wasn't about to let go. "I'll be here, whenever you're ready," I said, softly, almost tenderly. "I'll help you, but you have to take the first step." Tanya didn't respond, but I knew I'd planted the seed. I knew that, deep down, she was already considering it. The idea of leaving Jared was becoming more and more real to her. Esme, on the other hand, was a different story. The fight with Jared, the emotional distance between us, it all became too much for her. I could see it in her eyes when she tried to reach out to me after everything that had happened. She tried to reconnect, to rekindle something between us, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She wanted to go on a romantic date, to talk about our marriage, but I couldn't pretend that anything could fix what had been broken. When I turned her down, I saw the pain in her eyes. It was hard to look at, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't. Esme broke down that night, crying in front of me. "I'm so sorry, Zach," she said, her voice shaking. "I regret what I did. I regret everything. Please, can we try again?" But I couldn't answer her. I couldn't say anything. I just stood there, numb. "You've lost me, Esme," I finally said, my voice empty. "There's nothing left to fix." Esme's face crumpled. She could feel it too. She had lost me. That night, she turned to Claire McCabe, a colleague of hers, for comfort. Claire was a therapist, and she had always been a sympathetic ear for Esme. I don't know what they talked about, but I'm sure it wasn't anything good. Claire told Esme that she needed to focus on herself. There was no going back from what she had done. I could tell it hurt Esme to hear that. She wasn't ready to accept it, but I knew it was true. The damage had been done, and I wasn't going to fix it. Meanwhile, things between Tanya and I continued to evolve. As much as I hated the idea of having an affair, I couldn't deny that it felt good. Tanya was everything I'd wanted from Esme: attentive, affectionate, responsive. She made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Eventually, Tanya admitted to me what I already knew. She was in love with me. "I don't want to feel like this," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. "But I can't help it, Zach. I'm in love with you." And that was the turning point. The moment when everything changed. We began a physical affair, and with it came a sense of power. It wasn't just about sex or revenge. It was about taking control of a situation that had spiraled out of both of our hands. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was winning. But little did I know, all of this was leading to a point where things would go even further out of control. Revenge, it seemed, was a double-edged sword, and it was cutting deeper than I ever imagined. The weight of everything we'd done finally hit me in ways I didn't expect. I had spent so long focused on getting back at Jared, on seeking some twisted version of revenge, that I didn't fully grasp the cost until I saw Tanya at the crossroads of her own decisions. And as much as I hated to admit it, her choice wasn't just about her feelings for me. It was about something deeper, something that tied her to her own responsibilities and her own life. Tanya had been torn for weeks. She loved me, there was no doubt about that. But she also had children who depended on her. She had responsibilities that she couldn't just abandon, no matter how deep her feelings for me ran. But in the end, she couldn't stay married to Jared, not knowing what he had done and not willing to live a lie anymore. One evening, she finally found the courage to confront him. She stood in their home, her face set with determination. Jared wasn't expecting it, and when she told him she was leaving, his entire world seemed to shatter in front of him. "Are you really doing this, Tanya?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You're going to walk away from everything we built? From the kids, from me?" She stood her ground, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I can't keep living like this, Jared. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it isn't. I deserve more, and so do you. We both need to be free." Jared pleaded with her to reconsider, but it was too late. The final argument between them was explosive. Harsh words were exchanged. Years of bitterness, secrets, and regret spilling out in that one moment. But Tanya had already made up her mind. That night, she left him. She took only a few things with her, not wanting to complicate things further, but in the end, it was clear. Their marriage was over. Tanya moved in with me soon after. The moment she walked through the door, it was like everything shifted. We were finally together, but the weight of our actions loomed large. We had destroyed 2 marriages, burned bridges with people we'd once considered friends. And as much as I tried to tell myself I was satisfied, there was an ache I couldn't shake. The revenge had come at a cost I hadn't anticipated. Jared didn't take our affair lying down. In his pain and bitterness, he decided to strike back. He began spreading rumors about our relationship, telling anyone who would listen about the affair that had torn apart his marriage. He painted me as the villain, and Tanya as the heartless woman who abandoned her family for a man who had betrayed her. It didn't matter that the truth was more complicated than that. He wanted to ruin us, and he made sure everyone at work knew about it. Company events became increasingly awkward. Whenever I ran into people, the tension was palpable. They would glance at me and then quickly look away, whispering behind their hands. It felt like the entire office was judging us. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. We had given them the perfect story to gossip about. Meanwhile, Esme was making her own decisions, ones that would shape her future. After everything that had happened, I knew she had reached the point where she could no longer live in the shadow of our failed marriage. She couldn't fix what was broken between us, and I couldn't fix it either. So, she packed her bags and left. Esme moved into a small apartment, one that was a far cry from the life she had once imagined. I knew it wasn't easy for her. She was heartbroken, struggling with the weight of the divorce, but she was starting to rebuild her life. She focused on her career, spending more time with her patients, pouring herself into her work. She found a kind of fulfillment in helping others, in focusing on something other than the wreckage of her marriage. It wasn't easy for Esme, but she was starting to learn to live for herself again, something I had never allowed her to do during our time together. One day, Esme reconnected with Tim Grayson, a longtime family friend who had always been there for her, even when I wasn't. Tim had always been a steady presence in her life, a source of emotional support during tough times. When he heard about the divorce, he reached out to her, offering comfort and perspective. Their connection, at first purely platonic, began to grow stronger, and I could see that Esme was finding a way forward. It was strange, almost bittersweet, to think of her moving on, but I knew that she deserved it. We both did. As for Tanya and me, the weight of everything we'd done settled heavily on both of us. We had what we wanted, each other, but the cost of getting here was something we could never ignore. We had both lost everything to be with one another. Our marriages, our friends, our respect. What we had was tainted by the chaos we had created, and neither of us could escape it. There was a moment when I realized the depth of what we had done. Tanya and I were sitting on the couch one evening, talking about our future, when Sasha Knight, still angry about the confrontation at the gala, showed up unannounced. She had been avoiding both of us since that night, but she came to us now, her face full of anger and disappointment. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice tight with emotion. "You think you've got what you wanted, Jared out of the picture, your affair in the open, but you've lost everything. You've lost the respect of everyone who ever cared about you." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. She wasn't wrong. We had burned too many bridges, destroyed too many relationships, to simply move forward without consequence. "You may have gotten what you wanted in the short term," Sasha continued, her eyes narrowing, "but you'll never get back the trust you've lost. You'll never be the same." I felt a pang of guilt, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Sasha had been right all along. This wasn't just about getting back at Jared or winning Tanya's heart. It was about something deeper. And by the time I realized that, it was too late to undo the damage. The final blow came when Esme and I met in the courtroom. It wasn't the grand confrontation I had expected, but a quiet and somber moment as we signed our divorce papers. There was no animosity between us, no shouting or tears, just a mutual understanding that our lives had changed beyond repair. As we exchanged a final glance before walking away, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, sorrow, or perhaps just acceptance. But there was no turning back. We had both made our choices, and the consequences had been inevitable. I walked out of that courtroom with Tanya by my side, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of everything we had done was more than I could bear. We had won, but at what cost? In the end, revenge had come at a price I hadn't fully understood until it was too late. There was no joy in victory, No satisfaction in seeing my enemies defeated. Just a deep, hollow emptiness that I could never escape. And as I looked at Tanya, I realized that even though we had each other, we would never truly escape the chaos we had created. We were both broken in ways we couldn't fix, and I couldn't help but wonder if the price of revenge was more than either of us could ever afford.